Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be taking a 1/72nd scale Airfix Boulton Paul Defiant, which is one of the worst fighters of World War II, arguably, and we're going to be making it into the ultimate post-war jet fighter. So without further ado, let's get into it. So to provide a little bit of background to this project, a few months ago, Chris, aka Rex's Hanger, along with History of Everything and Lord Hardthrasher, hosted a model building competition with a category dedicated to wacky Kitbash type projects. Now my friend Chris had previously proposed in a certain live stream to take a Boulton Paul Defiant, enlarge it, and give it several upgrades from the MiG-29 to create a modern jet-powered ground attacker and night fighter for the Albanian Air Force under the codename Project Red Phoenix. Now this is obviously a brilliant idea and I was very inspired by it, so I decided to enter the build competition and loosely base my concept around the same idea, although mine would be to create a post-war development of the Defiant with the aim of producing a modern and capable 1950s era night fighter slash jet attacker for the RAF, while avoiding sending Britain spiralling into even more post-war debt by recycling old Defiant Mark I airframes. I wanted the idea to seem sensible enough, yet also be very impractical and in the most British way possible. It would still have fixed none of the Defiant's key flaws, and yet would also make it better. The first step to create this concept into a paper plane was to create some drawings. So I used GIMP to make some plans for the new fighter based on the original Defiant's drawings by adding in a few bits, plus doing some chopping and changing where required, and eventually I'd made my own Jetfiant blueprints. I used Blender to design several new parts for this aircraft based on my blueprints. The parts designed included a mould for the new nose section along with some recessed panel lines, some spare cockpit transparencies, the two engines which were basically taken from the Gloucester Meteor, and a new cockpit section combined with a nose wheel, including the bay for it to retract into, a radar which was roughly based on the Beaufighter and late Mosquito type night fighters, and a little generic avionics bay. I then used my Anycubic 4K 3D printer to print these parts, and fortunately they all turned out pretty good in the first couple of goes. I then used my smaller dental vacuforming machine I'd purchased to experiment with, and used it to vacuform the new nose section and canopy areas with some transparent 1mm thick plastic. And of course I would need a Boulton Paul Defiant to modify, so I got two of the Airfix 1/72nd scale kits. Being from 2015, it was a bit tricky to buy one brand new in Australia, but fortunately there was a place in the UK that had a pretty nice price for its shipping, so I ordered from them. I'll be doing a second video on the other Defiant, but for now we'll start with the first one. After the parts had been printed and vacuformed, I then gave them, along with the sprues for the kit, a wash in some warm soapy water to help remove any oil or residue and provide a good clean surface for the paint and glue to adhere to. The first modification to make a Jetfiant was to use my Tamiya scribing tool to slice the lower and upper wings along a particular structural spar point which I'd selected to attach the jet engines to. A slightly more tricky modification was to reverse the direction of the landing gear to better balance the aircraft while it was on the ground. To do this, I used my Tamiya scribing tool to cut out the area of the lower wing that had the landing gear bay, and then after attaching the interior piece for the landing gear bay, I then reassembled the lower part of the middle section of the wings so that the landing gear was in the opposite direction. Fortunately, everything fitted quite well together, and there was only really a bit of a gap which would need to be filled at a later point. Next, I glued the two upper wing pieces which were closest to the fuselage to the lower centre wing assembly, and once they were all in place, I used some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to glue both the resin jet engines to the centre wing section. The Odorless Rocket CA glue is pretty similar to regular super glue in that it dries really quickly, but it's slightly less brittle and it also dries clear, making it ideal for the resin and transparent parts in model kits. I gave the engine some time to dry and moved on to removing the plastic fuselage halves from their sprue and cutting off the sections that contained the original plane's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. I used a dental vacuformer to make the new forward fuselage sections, using the same clear plastic I used along with the canopy section, which I'll talk about a little bit later. These parts had to be cut out and then cleaned up from the plastic, and fortunately the 3D printed cockpit / nose wheel / avionics bay fitted perfectly with these vacuformed cockpit sections. I glued the outer two wing halve tops and bottoms together and then glued them to the engine nacelles with the rocket odorless CA glue to form the wing assembly, before then constructing the original kit's turret section and removing some of the original interior's bulkheads to fit the new cockpit in. The Jetfiant would not receive any forward-firing guns, but the rear armament would be upgraded with two 20mm Hispano cannons. To do this, I 3D printed a basic model to replace the kit's original 4 7mm Brownings, and the only modification I had to make was to glue these new 20mm guns to the cylinder which would hold them to the framework instead of using the kit's ones. Assembling the main landing gear came next, and this was pretty much exactly the same as for the regular Defiant. The landing gear parts fitted together really well with some very nice details, although I did find that the tyres had a bit of a seam line on them which required some sanding, and the detailing on the wheels in general was really quite softly moulded, which would make it very hard to paint it later on. The landing gear bay doors were installed, making sure that the middle set were facing the correct reversed direction, and then I started to paint the interior, including the forward and rear walls, the main 3D printed cockpit floor section and the turret, with Tamiya XF71 cockpit green. The two 3D printed instrument panels were then painted Vallejo flat black, and once the green had dried, I then painted the tyres, seats and the cockpit side walls a coat of flat black as well. At this time I decided to cut the radar seat off from the main cockpit floor just to make painting and assembly a little bit easier. A second coat of interior green was applied to the interior, and after it had dried I started to pick out the details in the avionics bay with the flat black, and also gave the other parts I'd previously painted black a second coat. The seat cushions were painted XF51 khaki drab using a fine brush, and then I used some XF16 flat aluminium to paint the landing gear for the nose wheel, the cannon barrels, to dry brush the throttle quadrants, and also to paint some of the raised switches on the pilot and radar operators panels. Vallejo flat white was used to paint the radar and some of the wiring in the nose section, and also to dry brush the gauges on the instrument panels. Further raised details in the cockpit were painted various colours, including Vallejo flat yellow, Vallejo vermilion red, Vallejo deep green, and some Tamiya XF53 neutral grey for some of the switches. I added some white blotches and then painted over them with X25 clear green to create the radar scope, and also X27 clear red was used for some warning lights in the cockpit. The 3D printed shell casings for the 20mm were painted X31 Titan Gold, and then I made some ejection handles for the seats using some fine wire for jewellery making, which was bent to a hoop and then glued to the top of the seats. I then glued the main instrument panel to the cockpit, and before adding the radar panel into its place, I painted some Vallejo gloss varnish onto all of the dials to make them look like they were behind glass. I applied some Tamiya black panel liner scent over all of the details for the cockpit, the nose wheel, and also the radar section to highlight their details, and once the panel liner had dried, I then rubbed over everything with a cotton bud dipped in X20 enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner and make them all a little bit lighter. The ejection handles were painted flat yellow, and then as an extra touch I used some Tamiya 1mm thick masking tape to add some seat belts. The forward cockpit and nose section were glued to the vacuum-formed forward fuselage using Deluxe Materials odorless rocket CA glue, and the fit was good, so I then used a combination of Revell Contactor Professional and some more of the glue to join the other fuselage half. The fit for the rear fuselage to the resin cockpit for the radar section was unfortunately not so good. I tried sanding all of the sidewall details on the cockpit halves since they wouldn't be visible anyways, and this did somewhat improve the fit for the fuselage halves. However, the real challenge proved to be fitting the floor to the wings. I continued to sand the fuselage sides down to make them thinner, and I used a knife and file to thin the section of wings that wouldn't fit to the cockpit floor. The fit was still pretty bad, but I decided it was acceptable, so I painted the floor section of the wings XF71 in case any of it was visible, and then I cut off and glued the nose cone halves together so that I could remove them later for displaying the radar. I then glued the radar section to one of the original rear fuselage halves, and then glued the other rear fuselage half together. While the fuselage halves bonded, I cut out and sanded the single-piece horizontal stabilizers and glued them into their slots on the fuselage, which they fitted into perfectly. The wings were then glued to the rear fuselage and the resin cockpit floor for the radio compartment. I then used a bulldog clip to help line up the forward added section of the fuselage, and once they were in place, I glued them together. Unfortunately, the fit between the old and new fuselage sections had a massive gap on one side, so I had to use some Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty to fill in the massive hole. I used a cocktail stick and a little bit of water to help blend and thin the putty and get it into the gaps. Further gaps were also filled with the Perfect Plastic Putty, including the ones between the new fuselage halves, the separated nose cones, the area between the wings and the fuselage, the gap where all of the panels had been rearranged for the undercarriage, and also to fill over some of the areas such as the keying for the radiator and various gaps along the wings and the engine attachments. I then gave the putty a day to dry and started to sand it smooth using various grades of sandpaper, gradually trying to get a bit finer. In hindsight, I probably should have added more putty and then sanded and repeated the process until I had a much smoother result, but I was in a bit of a rush to get this kit and a second one done in time for the deadline of the competition, so I only ended up doing one round of putty and sanding. The lost panel lines were then rescored using a knife and my Tamiya scriber, and after removing the particles with a damp cloth, I then moved on to some painting. I'd considered several different schemes for painting the Jetfiant, including the possibility of doing it in black all over, painting it in a partial camouflage with silver for some of the sections that had been added, giving it a panel beater look, or even doing silver all over or possibly yellow. In the end though, I decided to go for a regular camouflage pattern similar to the original Defiant, but do it in the post-war colours. I couldn't decide if I wanted to go with PRU blue or light grey for the underside, so in the end I decided to paint half of the underside with Vallejo 71109 faded PRU blue, and then for the opposite side I applied XF83 medium sea grey so I could decide which colour I preferred for the underside. Both of these paints were thinned and then applied with a brush in my normal fashion, and after one coat of each, I then painted the upper surface with a coat of Tamiya XF81 dark green RAF. I decided to paint the nose cone black separately along with the tyres for the main landing gear, and for the darker upper surface camouflage colour I went with XF82 Ocean Grey RAF and followed the brown pattern from the original aircraft guide as close as I could, outlining the shapes and then filling them in with my brush. Once the Ocean Grey had been applied and dried, I then did a second coat of XF81. Notice how I thin the paint to help keep my layers nice and thin, which helps to reduce the number of brush strokes and keeps all of the recessed panel lines visible. I use water to thin the Tamiya and Vallejo Model Colour and Model Air paints, which, although this is doable with the Tamiya paints, I have since been informed by Matt from Model Minutes, a much more experienced model maker than me I should point out, that water actually causes the acrylic Tamiya paints to dry out, and you should in fact use X20A acrylic thinners to thin them instead, which may be something I have to do in the future. I couldn't really decide if I preferred the grey or the PRU blue underside, although after doing a coin toss I ended up going with the PRU blue, which I then applied another coat of. I was hoping to use the kit's original transparent parts for the canopy, but they were actually slightly too small and thick to fit the new cockpit seats in, so I ended up vacuforming my own basic ones with the 3D printer to make the mould. The new canopy frames and sections were cut out and then cleaned up, and then painted several coats of XF71 to make their internal colours. While the XF71 dried, a third coat of PRU blue was then applied to the underside of the aircraft. Once the X71 on the canopy had dried, I then used a cocktail stick to carefully scratch off the excess paint and help neaten up the canopy frames, before I then glued the non-transparent middle sections and windscreen to the fuselage. A bit of putty was required to fill in the gaps between the canopy sections and the fuselage, and after that putty had dried, I then applied another coat of XF82 on the fuselage and started to use XF82 and 81 to paint the outside frames for the canopy. A third coat of XF81 was applied following the camouflage pattern and also onto the canopy frames, before a final coat of black was applied to the tyres. I did a few touch-ups on the canopy with Ocean Grey, and then a final coat of XF81 was applied to the aircraft, making a total of 4 coats. The wheel wells were painted with XF71 interior green before a fifth and final coat of XF82 was applied to the rest of the aircraft. A second coat of XF71 was applied to the wheel well, and the landing gear struts were then painted XF16 flat aluminium before a fourth and final coat of PRU blue was applied to neaten up any of the mistakes made when painting the wheel wells and to finally give a nice uniform finish to the underside. By now I was happy with how the camouflage looked, so I gave the whole aircraft a coat of Vallejo gloss varnish, which was thinned down with a little bit of water and applied with a brush. The gloss varnish provides a nice smooth surface for the decals and also helps to prevent them from silvering. Speaking of which, the decals included in this kit are of great quality naturally, being from Cartograph, but unfortunately I couldn't really use all of them as they were for early war Defiants. I could however use the fin flash and some of the common stencils that were appropriate for the jet-powered Defiants, and fortunately I had a few spare RAF markings for the later war aircraft, and a extra A was used as an identification on the fuselage. All the decals were dipped in warm water and then slid onto the model using a finger or a brush, and once all of them were in place, I then applied some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them to help them conform to the surface of the model, and then I used a cotton bud to apply some Vallejo decal softener to help make the decals more malleable so that they would sink into the recessed panels, and thus further appear as though they'd been painted on. After giving the decals a full 12 hours to dry, I then applied a coat of Vallejo semi-gloss varnish to give the paint and the decals a uniform finish and help blend them together. Ordinarily I would use matte varnish for most of my aircraft, but I wanted the Jetfiant to be a little bit more new and flashy, so I decided to go with a semi-gloss to give it a bit more of a shine and well-kept appearance. After the varnishes had dried, I then applied some Vallejo natural steel onto the exhausts to give them a darker metallic appearance, and then painted the inside of the engine intake with flat black to give it some depth. I applied a very small amount of XF16 flat aluminium around the engine intake, the canopy access points, the nose, landing gear, the walkway area, and around the turret to create some metal chipping, although I kept it a little bit more subtle than I would normally. I decided to add some non-slip material using 3mm masking tape applied to the wings, and then painted black so that the crew could walk along the wing area and to access the fuel ports and the three cockpits without sliding. Some grime and post-shading effects were created by applying some Tamiya black panel liner scent along various panels on the upper surface, along the edges of the control surfaces, and also quite heavily on the underside, especially around the landing gear and the flaps. The panel liner effect was then softened with some more X20 enamel thinners after it had dried, until I was left with a more subtle, greasy and streaking effect. For some further subtle weathering, I got out my Tamiya weathering master powders and used some black pigment to add burn marks on the exhausts and to create some grease streaks from the control hinges and stains coming from the landing gear and access hatches. Some sand pigments were brushed onto the walkway and landing gear to make them look a little bit dirty and slightly worn, and finally I added some rust pigments to the areas around the flaps and around the landing gear to add some extra colour and extra marks. At this stage I glued on the antenna and pitot tubes, and then the final thing to do was to create some lights. To create the landing light, I used a bit of aluminium packaging, which I cut into a circle and then glued into place, and then I added the included clear landing gear light cover from the kit over the top of it. The nav lights were made by painting Vallejo silver over where the nav lights would be, and then painting them either X27 or X26 to make them red or green, and once the antennas had been painted, the Boulton Paul Super Defiant in 1/72 scale was finally completed. And here you can see the final result. I think a quote from Jeremy Clarkson probably summarises best how I feel about this model.
The scope of my engineering genius literally knows no bounds.
Admittedly, due to a looming deadline and the fact I was doing several things for the first time, it's certainly not my most polished and well-built kit, but a very fun and rewarding experiment all the same. I really enjoyed trying some new techniques with the use of the printer and the vacuform parts, and I very much enjoyed the creative process of designing this rather wacky looking aircraft. Although it technically didn't end up winning the group build, I still feel like I succeeded in my goal of making something impractical, and thus keeping that Boulton Paul Defiant spirit, yet also making something unique and within the realms of possibility. I think this aircraft has a lot of character, and even though at first glance it looks like the Night Fighter Meteor with the tail of an ME-262, I think its tall landing gear, the 3-section canopy, and turret certainly make it stand out. So that wraps up my build video for the Airfix 1/72nd scale Super Jetfiant. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and of course I'll be doing a second video for the other Defiant, which had some slightly different modifications, so stay tuned for that one. If you enjoyed this rather different video, then please leave a like, and of course subscribe to the channel as it really helps out. And if you have any suggestions for how I could improve or other ideas, leave it down in the comment section below. And a big thank you of course to my patrons for helping me fund buying these kits in particular, which had to be ordered, and of course all of the products and stuff that I use to make them. I'll leave a link in the description to where you can join my Patreon if you want to get slightly early access to my videos ad-free, and every now and again for the upper tiers I'll be releasing some exclusive content, and of course discounts for my Colts shop. If this video does well and I get the inspiration, I may be tempted to do a few more Kitbashy kind of builds like this one, maybe even build my own designs from scratch potentially, but we'll see how things go. But thanks again for watching, and of course until the next video, take care, and as always, model on.